The night had a weight to it that could not be explained. It pressed against the walls of the small town like a living thing, seeping into every corner, every crack. According to local records, it was in the autumn of 1973 when Father Elias Moreau received the first unsettling letter, scrawled in ink that appeared to tremble on the paper, as if the hand that wrote it had been shaking from fear or something far worse. The letter contained nothing more than a single sentence: "He knows the names. They must never be spoken." The sender claimed to be a scholar, someone who had been investigating the Testament of Solomon, the ancient text that described King Solomon's dealings with spirits of the fallen. Most dismissed the letter as a hoax, the work of a troubled academic obsessed with arcane myths. But Father Moreau could not ignore the urgency. He had seen enough in his 40 years of ministry to recognize a warning when it was pressed upon him in such a precise, deliberate manner. The first reports of unusual activity began almost immediately after the letter arrived. The scholar, a man named Henri Duval, began experiencing strange phenomena in his study. According to witness statements, lights would flicker in rooms where no fixtures were present. Books would topple from shelves without explanation. The faint sound of whispering followed him through the halls, low and deliberate, almost conversational in nature. But the most disturbing events involved Duval himself. He would sometimes awaken in the early hours, trembling, covered in sweat, with no recollection of leaving his bed, but small scratches, like fingernail marks, appeared along his arms. Medical professionals were called in. They ran every test they could think of. Neurologists found nothing abnormal. Psychiatrists could not identify any form of delusion or psychosis. Yet the disturbances escalated. Neighbors reported hearing Henri speaking in languages no one could identify, often in guttural tones that seemed too low for a human throat. At times, he would cry out in rage and fear simultaneously, his voice a mixture of pleading and warning. The most chilling occurrence was that he began naming things, names that the witnesses would not forget. He spoke in a voice that was not entirely his own, whispering 7 distinct names. The attending priest, Father Moreau, examined the letters in Duval's handwriting. He recited each name quietly to himself, then froze. "These names," he muttered, "they are not for men to utter." The priest explained that ancient texts often referred to the power contained within names. In Solomon's Testament, the names of certain spirits were said to grant authority over them, but also to attract their attention if spoken carelessly. Duval, it seemed, had inadvertently drawn something toward himself by speaking them aloud. By the 3rd week, the manifestations had intensified. Doors slammed with no breeze. Mirrors cracked spontaneously. Shadows moved against the natural flow of light. Duval's health began to deteriorate rapidly. His skin grew pale, his eyes sunken. But it was the behavior that frightened those closest to him. He would sometimes speak to the shadows themselves, laughing at nothing, then screaming moments later as if the very walls had begun to speak back. Witnesses later reported seeing his body contort in ways that were physically impossible, angles that no human joint could achieve. The church formally intervened after an incident involving Duval's assistant, a young woman named Claire. She had been cataloging his notes when she suddenly screamed. Father Moreau and another priest rushed to the scene. They found her unconscious, surrounded by books that appeared to have fallen in concentric patterns around her. On the wall above her, etched deep into the plaster, were the 7 names Henri had spoken. The scratching had not been made by any human hand. Father Moreau described the room as charged with an oppressive presence, the very air thick and black. He ordered all windows opened, water blessed, and holy salt scattered. Yet even these precautions did little. Henri, by then, had begun speaking to the unseen entities with increasing clarity. He would stand in the center of the room and recite words from the Testament of Solomon, asking questions in tones both reverent and terrified. At times, he would pause mid-phrase, glance upward as if listening, and tremble uncontrollably. Attempts to exorcise the presence before official church sanction proved futile. The first priest to intervene recounted later that he had felt a crushing weight pressing on his chest, as if the room itself was alive. Objects flew across the chamber. Henri, during this initial exorcism attempt, spoke the names again, louder this time, as if defying the entity. The attending priest collapsed to his knees, unable to proceed. By the end of the night, Duval had fallen into a catatonic state, unresponsive to anyone around him, yet faint whispers were audible coming from his room. The church convened a council to determine the next steps. Father Moreau was selected as the lead exorcist. He prepared carefully, reviewing ancient manuscripts and consulting texts in Latin, Hebrew, and Aramaic. He was meticulous, aware that the margin for error was minuscule. He noted that the entity seemed to respond to both recognition and defiance. Acknowledgement of its names increased its activity, while avoidance seemed to diminish it temporarily. The first official exorcism took place on a cold night in late November. The room was stripped to essentials. Candles burned at each corner. Salt and blessed water formed protective boundaries. Father Moreau recited prayers and incantations, invoking the authority of God. Henri, still pale and emaciated, sat in the center, eyes closed, hands shaking. For hours, the priest read aloud, his voice steady, but his body tense. Henri groaned, convulsed, and at times his body seemed to respond independently, leaning backward at impossible angles or twitching violently. As the night wore on, Henri began whispering the names again. The priest interrupted him, commanding silence. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Father Moreau reported that the air grew frigid, frost forming along the edges of the windows. Shadows lengthened unnaturally. Objects lifted and hovered. Henri's voice alternated between his own terrified tone and a deep, resonant voice that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. The presence was aware of them, aware of the attempt to control it, and it resisted with a relentless intensity. By the fifth hour, the manifestations had escalated to a point where the room itself seemed to rebel. Candles flickered out, leaving only the dim gray light of the moon. Henri spoke again, this time shouting the names in defiance. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Father Moreau later described the sensation as a living, conscious force, reacting to each word, each movement. He struggled to maintain control, relying on scripture and prayer alone, knowing that any lapse could end in disaster. Witnesses who remained outside the room reported hearing Henri's voice alternate between pleading and commanding, at times speaking in languages none could recognize. Shadows moved across the floor in strange patterns, and a low, guttural hum resonated through the house. Some described it as music, others as moaning. One neighbor later recalled the sound as the voice of something waiting, patient, and infinitely ancient. The exorcism continued into the early hours. Father Moreau noted that every time Henri avoided speaking the 7 names, the presence weakened slightly. But the moment he lapsed, even in his delirium, the force returned with renewed fury. Items in the room would shift positions, books would fall, and an unnatural wind would whip through the chamber, despite closed windows and doors. At one point, Henri's body arched backward violently, balancing only on his head and shoulders. The priest held him down with difficulty, repeating prayers as Henri's voice morphed into a chorus of tones, some human, some unhuman. The room felt alive, and the priest realized, with a cold certainty, that the entity was studying them, learning, adapting to their methods. Hours blurred together. Sleep, food, and water were abandoned. Father Moreau became increasingly aware that this was not a simple possession but a battle for authority and control. The entity understood language, names, and symbols. It tested boundaries. It knew the Testament of Solomon, knew the power of the names, and the consequences of their utterance. By dawn, Henri was exhausted, silent, and unresponsive. Father Moreau, drained and trembling, documented every detail, knowing that these notes might be the only record of what occurred. Yet even in this moment of apparent calm, he sensed the presence lingering, like a shadow beyond the limits of perception. He wrote that it does not rest. It waits, patient, for the names to be spoken again. The second day brought new horrors. Henri, briefly lucid, began recounting visions of places and events no human could witness. He spoke of doors opening in the sky, of faces appearing in walls, and of whispers that promised knowledge and power in exchange for obedience. Father Moreau restrained him gently, trying to keep him focused on prayer. But the visions were too strong, the force too persistent. Henri described the entity as a being that could perceive thoughts, anticipate movements, and manipulate reality around it. The priest noted that these reports could not be explained by natural means. There were no drugs, no medical conditions, no psychiatric explanation that could account for the phenomena. He began to fear that if the names were spoken again, the entity might cross the threshold into the world fully. The following nights became a test of endurance. The entity's reactions to the 7 names were unpredictable. Sometimes, mere mention in thought seemed to provoke a reaction. Henri would groan, convulse, or speak the names under his breath without knowing it. The priests involved had to constantly monitor him, ensuring that each whisper was caught, each reaction contained. The house became a fortress of prayer, candles, and protective symbols. Father Moreau recorded that the entities seemed to recognize the hierarchy among the clergy. It tested each priest differently. Some were ignored for long stretches, while others were attacked more aggressively. One young priest reportedly felt his very memory and while bending under the presence's pressure, struggling to remember prayers he had recited 1,000 times before. By the end of the week, the tension in the house had reached a breaking point. Father Moreau realized that this was not a single entity in isolation but a complex force, perhaps multiple consciousnesses operating under one will. He noted in his journal, "It is as if it remembers, as if it catalogues each attempt against it. It is patient, calculating, infinitely ancient." It was during the 7th night that Henri, in a near catatonic state, began to whisper something new. Not the names themselves, but fragments of sentences in languages unknown. Father Moreau approached cautiously, praying all the while. The whispering became intelligible, though the words were not human. They seemed to carry meaning, warnings, and commands. The priest felt a cold terror as he realized that Henri was now acting as a medium, translating messages from something utterly alien and powerful. The air was heavy, and the silence between words carried weight. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, stretching toward the candles as if trying to snuff out the light. Henri's voice rose again, trembling but forceful, as he recited one of the names, but only partially. The reaction was instantaneous. Objects flew. The floor trembled. The priest's own voice faltered as he struggled to regain control. Father Moreau knew, in that moment, that speaking these names, even to counter the entity, was dangerous. He altered his approach, focusing on indirect containment, prayer, and ritual symbols, avoiding direct confrontation with the names themselves. It was a delicate balance, each action measured, each word calculated. The entity seemed to test them at every opportunity, exploiting even the smallest lapse. Henri's whispers grew more fragmented, more urgent, as though he were aware of the stakes yet powerless to resist. The priests could feel the presence pressing against the boundaries of the room, a living, intelligent force, waiting for the moment when a single name would be uttered again. The night stretched onward, and the house seemed suspended in time, caught between the natural and the unnatural. Father Moreau wrote that the air itself feels sentient, observing us, anticipating. The shadows move not with the wind, but with intent. Suddenly, Henri's eyes opened fully. They were no longer his own. The voice that came from him was deeper, resonant, articulate in a way that made the priests tremble. It spoke of knowledge, of power, of fear, and of the 7 names that must never cross a human tongue. The room grew deathly silent. Even the candles seemed to hold their breath. Henri's body convulsed, but the voice was steady, deliberate. It spoke not to the priests, but to something beyond the walls. Father Moreau's hand shook as he held the book of prayers. He realized that the entity was not merely resisting, it was communicating, and every word carried weight, as if the fabric of the house itself responded to its will. Then, with a sudden movement, Henri fell silent, his body slumping to the floor. The room was still. The shadows receded slightly. The entity, for reasons unknown, had paused. Father Moreau dared not breathe, did not dare move. He only whispered prayers, listening for the slightest sound that might betray the presence. It was in this pause, this fragile silence, that he noticed the faintest trace of a message on the wall, a new inscription, faint but deliberate. Not made by human hand, yet unmistakably there. And beneath it, he could swear he saw the faintest, fleeting outline of the 7 names, written not in ink, but in shadow itself. The air remained heavy, the tension palpable. Father Moreau knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was far from over. The entity had not left. It had not been defeated. It was watching, waiting, remembering. And it would not forgive if those names were ever spoken again. Father Moreau sat in the center of the room, knees pressed to the cold wooden floor, gripping the edges of his prayer book as if it were a lifeline. Henri remained motionless, his breathing shallow but steady, though the eerie calm did not reassure the priest. The shadows along the walls quivered subtly, like smoke stirred by an unseen hand. Every instinct in Father Moreau told him that the pause was deliberate, not mercy, but strategy. The entity had withdrawn only to gather strength, to study, to wait for the slightest misstep. Over the next several days, Henri's condition fluctuated. At times he seemed lucid, able to converse quietly, answering questions about his visions with trembling clarity. At other moments, he would sink into convulsions, whispering fragments of forbidden knowledge, repeating the 7 names under his breath. The priests established a strict regimen, continuous prayer, nightly exorcism attempts limited to protective rituals, and constant monitoring. Henri was never left alone, and yet the entity found ways to manifest even when attention was directed elsewhere. One evening, Claire, the assistant, noticed a faint rhythm in Henri's whispered repetitions. She traced it carefully, counting syllables, listening to the subtle intonations. It was as if he were reciting something intentionally, like a coded message, a warning embedded in the cadence of his mutterings. She brought her observations to Father Moreau, who confirmed her suspicion. The entity was communicating through Henri, using him as a medium to relay its knowledge and its rules. Father Moreau documented everything meticulously, writing long entries each night. He described hallucinations that were both real and unreal, shadows that reflected figures not present, whispers that mimicked voices of loved ones long dead, and an oppressive feeling of being observed even outside the house. It became clear to him that the entity was not bound to Henri alone. It had permeated the space itself, the air, the walls, the very light. Witnesses who visited reported similar experiences, cold spots that defied natural explanation, fleeting glimpses of distorted shapes, and an almost imperceptible murmur that seemed to come from every direction at once. The priests realized that their standard exorcism procedures were insufficient. They turned to the Testament of Solomon, poring over the passages that described methods for binding and controlling spirits through knowledge, ritual, and intent. Father Moreau became increasingly convinced that the key was not brute spiritual force but understanding, an intimate, precise manipulation of language and ceremony. The names themselves were weapons and triggers. Speaking them invited chaos, avoiding them allowed containment, but only temporarily. One night, during a particularly long vigil, Henri began drawing symbols in the air with his fingers, moving slowly, deliberately. The movements were not random, they mirrored diagrams in the Testament of Solomon. Father Moreau observed closely, recognizing that Henri was unconsciously attempting to reconstruct the rituals described in the text. It was as if the entity was compelling him, guiding him to enact the very bindings meant to contain it. The following exorcism was planned with extreme care. Father Moreau and 2 other priests arrived at Henri's residence shortly before midnight. Candles were arranged in a precise configuration, circles drawn with salt, and protective inscriptions etched on the walls. The air was heavy with incense, though even this could not mask the chill that seemed to seep from the corners of the room. Henri lay on a low mattress, trembling, murmuring fragments of forbidden language. Father Moreau began with prayers of authority, invoking the names of saints, angels, and the power of God, carefully avoiding the 7 names the entity sought. Henri's body stiffened almost immediately, muscles tightening, as if resisting the words. Shadows thickened at the edges of the candlelight, moving like liquid, curling toward the priest with silent intent. The entity tested the boundaries of the circle, probing for weaknesses. For hours, Henri alternated between lucidity and violent spasms. His whispers grew urgent, fragmented, as if the entity were attempting to communicate a last-minute strategy. One of the attending priests reported hearing a phrase repeated over and over, though no one could translate it. The tone was unmistakably commanding, with a cadence that conveyed both threat and intelligence. Father Moreau noted, "This is not random possession. It is tactical. It understands our methods and seeks to circumvent them." The breakthrough occurred when Henri began to describe the entity's origin, its memory of ancient events. He spoke of spirits bound by Solomon, imprisoned in vessels, forced to labor under human command. The entity's resentment was palpable, a slow-burning rage that seeped through Henri's voice. It had remembered centuries of subjugation, centuries of silence enforced by knowledge. And now it had been called forth, and it would not forgive. Father Moreau realized that the 7 names represented not just power, but a contract of sorts. Speaking them was a violation of natural law, a transgression that allowed the entity to interact with the material world beyond the usual constraints. It was not merely possession, it was a negotiation of authority, a contest over knowledge itself. The priests understood that containment required careful orchestration, maintaining silence regarding the names while exerting authority through ritual and intent. Henri, exhausted and fragile, became a reluctant partner in the exorcism. His body was weak, yet his mind occasionally flickered with clarity, recalling specific phrases and passages from the Testament that could reinforce the protective measures. Father Moreau guided him carefully, instructing him to focus on intent rather than speech, to visualize the boundaries rather than articulate them. The entity, recognizing these methods, intensified its attacks, testing Henri's focus, threatening collapse. On the 5th night of this particular session, the entity escalated its aggression. Candles were extinguished without cause, objects levitated, and a low, guttural hum filled the room. Henri's body contorted into impossible angles, the muscles straining against invisible force. Father Moreau and the other priests pressed closer, reciting prayers, invoking divine authority, and maintaining the protective circles. The house itself seemed to respond, the walls vibrating subtly with the unseen power contained within. Henri suddenly spoke a partial name, and the reaction was immediate. The room's temperature plummeted. Shadows stretched and fractured into impossible forms. The entity, drawn by the syllable, lashed out with forceful intent, throwing Henri across the room. Father Moreau caught him mid-fall, praying fiercely. The intensity of the manifestation served as a terrifying reminder. Even a fragment of the forbidden names was enough to provoke a full response. Hours passed in tense silence punctuated by bursts of movement and sound. Henri, finally regaining partial control, whispered fragments of protective incantations from Solomon's Testament, guided by Father Moreau. The entity recoiled slightly, as if constrained by the understanding that it could not fully manifest while the protective measures remained intact. Yet the room remained charged with tension, a delicate equilibrium held only by vigilance and unwavering focus. By the morning, Henri was exhausted, barely able to speak, yet alive. Father Moreau documented every detail, noting the entity's behavior, reactions, and strategies. He realized that their understanding of the 7 names had shifted. They were not merely labels for the spirits, they were keys, conduits of power that allowed the entity to act in the material world. Avoiding their utterance was essential, yet knowledge of them provided a means to contain the force indirectly. In the days that followed, Henri's condition slowly stabilized. He remained under constant observation, and the house was fortified with additional protective symbols and rituals. Father Moreau maintained a careful balance, guiding Henri through necessary prayers, reinforcing the protective measures, and ensuring the 7 names were never spoken, even in thought. Yet the entity lingered, patient, watching, waiting. Witnesses reported that even after the active exorcisms concluded, the house carried an oppressive weight. Objects shifted subtly, faint whispers were audible at night, and the shadows never quite aligned with the light. Father Moreau described the atmosphere as a reminder that certain knowledge carries consequences. Some things, once known, cannot be unlearned, and some names must never be spoken. Henri later recounted fragmented memories of the entity, describing it not as malevolent in the sense of cruelty, but as deliberate, intelligent, and aware. It was ancient, bound by laws unknown to humanity, yet capable of influence when provoked. He spoke of the terrifying clarity with which it reacted to every syllable, every thought, every hint of acknowledgement. The 7 names were more than words. They were contracts, warnings, and instruments of power that demanded respect. Father Moreau's final notes on the matter were stark. The entity remained. It had been contained, not destroyed, and would wait patiently, always aware of the fragile human boundaries that kept it from manifesting fully. The house remained a place of caution, a space where the faintest whisper could awaken forces far beyond comprehension. The Testament of Solomon, once a study of curiosity, had become a warning. Knowledge itself can be a weapon, and the names it contains are not for men to utter lightly. The story of Henri Duval and the 7 names became a whispered caution among clergy and scholars alike. The entity's presence persisted, subtle but undeniable, a shadow lurking just beyond perception. The lesson was clear. To speak the names is to invite a force of intelligence, patience, and power, one that remembers centuries of confinement and is capable of reacting with calculated precision. Even decades later, those who entered the house reported subtle disturbances, fleeting shadows, chills that defied explanation, and the faintest hint of whispering in languages unrecognized. Father Moreau, long retired, never returned, but he remained certain of one truth: some names exist in the world that must never cross human lips. And if they are spoken, even in ignorance, the consequences are not immediate. They are eternal, patient, and watching. The Testament of Solomon, in its caution and arcane detail, preserves more than ritual. It preserves boundaries. The 7 names are not simply labels, but instruments of both power and peril. To know them is to understand restraint. To speak them is to awaken something ancient, deliberate, and profoundly aware. Henri survived, but the presence did not leave. It remains, waiting, knowing that one day, someone else may be tempted or forced to speak the forbidden names. And so, in that quiet, unremarkable town, in a house that appeared ordinary to the casual observer, the memory of the 7 names lingers. A whispered warning, a shadow, a presence that bends the air with unseen pressure. The Testament of Solomon is not just history. It is a testament to the danger of knowledge and the enduring power of names that must never, under any circumstances, be spoken. The entity waits still, patient beyond measure. And somewhere, in the silence, Henri sometimes hears a voice, reminding him of the cost of curiosity and the weight of words that should never exist in the world of men.